In April of 1990, the Massachusetts state legislature rewrote the state's corporate law in a matter of days. Governor Michael Dukakis signed the bill surrounded by cheering factory workers and framed the fight as a second war of independence. Roughly 120 members of Congress wrote to the President of the United States demanding a national security investigation. All of it, the emergency session, the letters, the talk of war, happened to protect one company. Not a bank, not an aerospace giant. A company in Worcester, Massachusetts that made grinding wheels. To understand why an entire state went to the barricades for abrasive grain, you have to go back more than 130 years, to a failing pottery shop and a bet worth exactly 1 bucket of beer. You are watching Trade Archive. If this is your kind of history, like the video and subscribe before we head back to Worcester. The story begins around 1858, when Franklin B. Norton and his older cousin Frederick Hancock arrived in Worcester from Bennington, Vermont. The Nortons were a pottery family, generations deep in the trade, and Frank set up shop making the unglamorous inventory of 19th century life. Stoneware jugs, redware crocks, mugs, bottles, spittoons. When railroad construction undermined his original site near Washington Square, he moved the operation to 41 Water Street, and to staff his kilns, he hired immigrant potters from Höganäs, a ceramics town on the Swedish coast. That single hiring decision, made for nothing more than craft skill, would shape the company, the neighborhood, and eventually the darkest chapter of its history. Then came the Panic of 1873. The American economy collapsed into a depression that lasted years, and the market for household pottery collapsed with it. Frank Norton needed anything that would keep the kilns paying for themselves. He had seen a grinding wheel produced in Detroit, a wheel bonded with silicate rather than the old method of gluing emery grains onto a wooden core. And according to company lore, he bet his crew a bucket of beer that they could not duplicate it. A Swedish potter named Sven Pulson took the bet. Pulson mixed emery, a natural abrasive, into slip clay and fired 3 experimental wheels at around 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit. Wheels had a habit of cracking or bursting inside the kiln, and 2 of Pulson's did fail. One came out whole, vitrified, the clay fused into a glassy bond that gripped the abrasive grain solid. It was harder, truer, and more durable than anything on the market. Frank Norton patented the process in 1877 and put the wheels into production by 1879. And then he mostly ignored them. Norton was a potter at heart, and grinding wheels only went into the kiln when there were no jug orders to fill. Pulson, frustrated at watching his invention treated as a sideline, walked away around 1880. His brother-in-law, John Jepson, another Höganäs man, took over the wheelwork and became the master of setting the kiln, the man who understood exactly how heat moved through a stack of drying wheels. A young salesman named Walter Messer began pushing the wheels to machine shops across the country on generous credit terms. American industry was expanding. Every factory needed to sharpen and shape hardened metal, and the orders kept coming. It was dangerous work even then. A wheel with a hidden flaw, fired wrong or bonded unevenly, could burst in the kiln, or, far worse, shatter at speed on a customer's arbor. And Jepson's obsession with consistent firing was as much about safety as quality. Frederick Hancock, a potter to his bones, wanted nothing to do with the new direction and walked away from the partnership rather than watch jugs give way to industry. By the early 1880s, the sideline had swallowed the pottery business anyway. Frank Norton, in failing health and mounting debt, was ready to let go. In 1884, Jepson, Messer, and a businessman named Charles Allen offered him $10,000 for the entire grinding wheel operation and its patents. He took it. To capitalize the new venture, they brought in 4 more Worcester men, including 2 figures from the Worcester Polytechnic Institute. Milton P. Higgins ran W.P.Y's Washburn shops, and George I. Alden taught mechanical engineering there. Alongside Fred Daniels and Horace Young, the seven partners incorporated the Norton Emery Wheel Company in June of 1885, with Higgins as president, a post he would hold until his death in 1912. These were not men who spent money for show. To save on engineering fees, they had Worcester Polytechnic Institute students survey the cheap farmland they bought in the Greendale neighborhood on the edge of Worcester, close to two rail lines, where a new factory went up in 1886. The founders skipped their own dividend that first year to keep cash in the business. That conservatism carried them through the Depression of 1893, while competitors folded, helped by overseas sales that Charles Allen had been building since 1891. And by the mid-1890s, the company could claim the largest inventory of grinding wheels in the world, with distribution reaching Chicago, New York, and across Europe. And the pottery inheritance mattered more than anyone outside the trade understood. Older abrasive firms simply quarried natural stone and cut it into wheels. Norton brought a ceramicist's discipline to the work, the exact proportioning of grain and bond, the controlled ramp of kiln temperature, the grading of product by grain, grit, and grade. They were manufacturing consistency in an industry built on geological luck. Their caution cut both ways. In 1891, an inventor named Edward Acheson came to Norton looking for backing. He had synthesized silicon carbide in an electric arc furnace, a man-made abrasive harder than almost anything found in nature, and Norton turned him down. Acheson went to the Pittsburgh banker Andrew Mellon instead and built the Carborundum Company, which would spend the next half-century as Norton's fiercest rival. It was the kind of mistake a company only gets to survive once, and Norton spent the next decade making sure it never happened again. Because the future of the industry was arriving from two directions at once. One was materials. The other was a machine, and the machine came with a man attached. Charles Hotchkiss. Norton was no relation to Frank. Born in Plainville, Connecticut in 1851, he started work at 15 as a chore boy at the Seth Thomas Clock Company, where he spent 2 decades absorbing the gospel of interchangeable parts, the idea that precision could be manufactured rather than handcrafted. In 1886, he moved to Brown Sharpe in Providence to improve their universal grinding machines, and by 1890 he was a partner in Leland, Falconer, and Norton in Detroit, a precision shop whose lineage ran straight into the founding of Cadillac. Detroit taught him what the coming automobile would demand from metal. When he returned to Brown Sharpe in 1896, he brought a heresy with him. The entire machine tool world treated grinding as a finishing touch, a light polish applied after the lathe had done the real cutting. Norton wanted to invert that. He envisioned a grinder heavy enough and rigid enough to take a part straight from the rough forging and cut it to final size in a single operation, with a wheel far wider than anything in use. Brown Sharpe looked at the proposal and saw an expensive absurdity. So in 1900, at 49 years old, Charles Norton took his drawings to Worcester, where the men of the Norton Emery Wheel Company understood something Providence did not. A machine that consumed grinding wheels at industrial scale was the best possible advertisement for a company that made grinding wheels. They backed him, and the Norton Grinding Company was born. By November of 1900, the first 2 machines, each capable of grinding work 18 inches in diameter and 96 inches long, stood finished on the shop floor. The production grinder that followed was a monster for its era, and every pound of it was an argument. Norton understood that in grinding, mass is accuracy. A light machine flexes and chatters under a heavy cut, and the vibration prints itself onto the work, so he designed around an enormous cast-iron bed, poured, aged, and hand-scraped flat, with a rigid spindle carrying a wheel far wider than the narrow discs the industry knew. The finished machine weighed over 15,000 pounds, swung workpieces up to 1,200 pounds, and carried a micrometer feed that let an ordinary operator bring a steel shaft down to 1/4 of an inch, 0.00025 inches, again and again, all day long. The skill was no longer in the man's hands. It was cast into the iron. Charles Norton filed the patent in 1901 and received it in 1904. What the machine did to the economics of metalworking was almost unfair. A crankshaft journal that took a skilled machinist roughly 5 hours of careful handwork with lathe, file, and gauge came off Norton's grinder in about 15 minutes, and it came off more accurate. Detroit noticed. Automobile parts had to fit together with a precision that hand methods could not deliver at volume, and Henry Ford equipped his Highland Park plant with Norton production grinders to machine the Model T. A plaque preserved today in the Henry Ford collection describes the 1900 machine as the first high-production cylindrical grinding machine, and Ford himself credited the grinding process as one of the reasons a car could be sold cheaply at all. The company would later estimate that 95% of an automobile's moving parts required grinding. Every crankshaft, every camshaft, every piston pin in the flood of cars remaking America passed under an abrasive wheel, and an enormous share of those wheels, and the machines spinning them, came from Greendale. Charles Norton kept refining the line, developing crankshaft grinders and camshaft grinders, purpose-built for engine work. And in 1925, the Franklin Institute recognized his life's work with the John Scott Medal. The Georgian Revival house he built back home in Plainville in 1922, named Sharpenhoe after an English estate he admired, stands today as a National Historic Landmark. While Charles Norton rebuilt the machine, the parent company was rebuilding the material itself. Natural emery and corundum were wildly inconsistent, and a company selling precision could not keep gambling on what came out of the ground. In 1897, the chemist Charles B. Jacobs had developed a process for fusing bauxite ore in an electric arc furnace to produce artificial corundum, pure crystalline aluminum oxide, and Norton secured the technology and the name that would carry it. Alundum. Making it at scale was the hard part. An arc furnace running above 1,800 degrees Celsius ate through carbon-lined crucibles, and the melts were dangerous, expensive, and slow. The answer came from inside the founding families. Aldus Higgins, son of President Milton Higgins and a WPI-trained patent lawyer running Norton's new plant at Niagara Falls, invented a water-cooled furnace in 1901 with an unlined iron shell. Water flowed continuously over the outside of the shell, in full view of the operator, while a crust of the fused bauxite itself formed the insulating lining. The furnace could run hard, continuously, and safely, fed by cheap Niagara hydroelectric power. Higgins patented it in 1904 and earned the John Scott Medal for it in 1913, and versions of his design still make fused alumina around the world today. The process itself has a brutal elegance. Bauxite goes into the furnace with coke and iron borings, additives that pull the impurities out of the melt. The arc fuses the ore into a solid ingot of synthetic corundum, which is then broken, crushed, and screened into precisely graded grain. That grain travels to Worcester, where it is blended with feldspar and clay bonds, moistened, packed into steel molds, and squeezed in hydraulic presses into green wheels. The wheels are dried, fired in kilns toward 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit until the bond vitrifies into glass around every particle, then trued, balanced, and spun past their rated speed as a final proof test before they ever ship, because a wheel that is going to burst should burst behind a steel guard in Worcester, not beside a machinist's face in Detroit. Every finished wheel carries its identity and code, the abrasive type, the grit size, the grade of the bond, so that a customer reordering from the other side of the world gets a wheel indistinguishable from the last one. It is pottery, perfected into an exact science, and the same furnaces opened whole new catalogs. Fused alumina and silicon carbide were not just abrasives, but refractories, materials that laughed at heat, and Norton pressed them into furnace linings, laboratory crucibles, muffles, and kiln furniture sold to the very industries its wheels already served. Its own silicon carbide, branded Crystalon, went head-to-head with Acheson's Carborundum in the material Norton had once refused to fund. By 1906, synthetic abrasives had so completely displaced the old material that the Norton Emery Wheel Company dropped the Emery and became, simply, the Norton Company. That same decade, it trademarked Alundum and crystallon, its own silicon carbide, filing both marks on the same day in July of 1914. By 1906, the two Norton firms together employed more than 1,000 people. A workforce that size changes a city, and Norton set out to shape the change. The shop floor of the abrasives division was overwhelmingly Swedish, roughly three-quarters of it by 1915, recruited through the Jeppson network that ran all the way back to Höganäs. On the floor itself, the company ran on the piece rate and the stopwatch. Norton was an early adopter of the Taylorist gospel of scientific management, time and motion studies, and pay tied directly to output, which meant a man's wages rose and fell with the speed of his hands and the endurance of his back. Around that grind, the company wrapped its people in what the era called welfare capitalism. A company newspaper, the Norton Spirit, launched in 1914. Health, safety, and training departments followed by 1915. And in 1914, Norton broke ground on something grander, a planned residential village for its workers called Indian Hill, designed by the New York architect Grosvenor Atterbury. 59 houses stood finished by 1916 along curving, tree-lined streets named for the heroes of electricity and industry, Watt, Marconi, Westinghouse. The neighborhood survives today as Worcester's largest planned worker community, listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1980. But paternalism has a ledger, and in September of 1915, the bill came due. A machinist's strike swept Worcester's metal trades, and workers in the Norton grinding machine division walked out demanding an 8-hour day, a 5-cent raise, and overtime pay. Management did not treat it as a negotiation. President George Alden and Superintendent John Spence read the demands as ingratitude. By the 1st of October, they had fired around 20 union organizers, and on October 9th, they locked out the entire division. To come back, a man had to sign a yellow dog contract renouncing the union. Of 570 workers, 245 signed. The other 325 were fired outright and blacklisted through the National Metal Trades Association. Their names circulated so no member shop in the region would hire them. Spence reportedly bragged that if discharged men caused trouble, he would knock them on the head with a chunk of steel and throw them out the window. The State Board of Conciliation and Arbitration condemned the manufacturer's conduct. It changed nothing. The strike was dead by the end of the year, and Norton stayed an open shop for decades. The Great War made the question moot for a while. War production swelled both Norton companies, and on June 24, 1919, they formally merged into a single entity, the Norton Company, with Alden as chairman, Charles Allen as president, Aldus Higgins as treasurer, and John Jeppson's son George as works manager. By 1920, Norton ranked among the 400 largest industrial companies in the United States, with plants going up in Germany, France, England, and Canada. In 1929, the 10 largest American abrasives makers even pooled their export business into a joint venture called Durex to carve up foreign markets together, from a bucket of beer to a multinational in under 50 years. Yet the machine division that had made the company famous was quietly going stale. Norton built its grinders one at a time, craftsman fashion, while the industry it had created moved on to newer designs, and some models went nearly 3 decades without meaningful improvement. When centerless grinding emerged, a faster way to finish round parts without mounting them between centers, Norton ceded the field to hungrier competitors, and Charles Norton himself, the great heretic of 1900, became the establishment resisting the next heresy. He would work on into old age and die in 1942, honored everywhere as the man who taught America to grind, his own division already living on borrowed prestige. Then came the decade that Norton's official histories preferred to forget. Worcester in the 1920s was one of the most Swedish cities in America, and its Swedish Protestant working class, concentrated in Greendale and Quinsigamond Village, lived in open rivalry with the city's large Irish Catholic population. When the Second Ku Klux Klan surged through New England, it came not primarily as anti-black terror, but as anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant nationalism, and it found its most receptive audience in exactly the community Norton had spent 40 years recruiting. The historian Kevin Hickey, studying the period, estimated around 4,000 Klan members in Greater Worcester in 1924, about half of them Swedish, and concluded that roughly 60% of the area's Klansmen worked at the Norton Company. The abrasives plant that made the Model T possible was also, by that estimate, the largest single employer of the local Klan. It boiled over in October of 1924. The Klan staged a massive one-day gathering at the fairgrounds in Greendale, within sight of Norton's own neighborhood. Somewhere between 9,000 and 15,000 people attended, 1,000 of them in full hooded regalia, and 2,600 new members were inducted that day. Word spread through the Catholic city below, and after midnight around 800 anti-Klan Worcesterites massed at Harrington Corner, where Main Street meets Pleasant near City Hall, and ambushed the Klansmen driving home. They stoned the cars, smashed windows, and dragged men into the street. The Worcester Telegram's front page told the story in a single headline: Klansmen beaten in street, cars stoned, women injured. Dozens of men, half a dozen women, and a police officer were hurt that night, and the largely Irish police force made exactly 2 arrests. Norton's leadership eventually distanced itself from the Klan as the movement collapsed, but the record remains. A hiring pipeline built on ethnic loyalty had fed something far uglier than company spirit. Through it all, the business kept compounding. In 1931, Norton made its first acquisition, the Bear Manning Company of Watervliet, New York, and with it entered coated abrasives, the sandpaper and abrasive belts sold under the Bear brand. It became one of the most reliable engines in the whole enterprise. By 1951, Bear Manning turned out more than 30,000 distinct items and roughly $30 million in annual sales, and by the late 1950s, its monthly profits were outrunning the parent companies. Norton also folded in the Pike Company, the New Hampshire firm that had been quarrying and selling natural sharpening stones since the 1820s, so that the Arkansas oil stones in a carpenter's toolbox and the India and crystalline bench stones on a machinist's bench all came, one way or another, out of the same Worcester empire. The Depression tested the old paternalism, and this time Norton met it differently than it had met the strikers. Where the brief recession of the early 1920s had seen 80% of the workforce laid off, the company now staggered shifts and shortened weeks to keep about half its people on the payroll through the worst years. Then the Second World War arrived and swallowed every spare wheel and machine the company could produce. Employment surged to around 12,000, including nearly 1,900 women who took stations on the grinding floor, turning out abrasives and precision ground parts for aircraft engines, gun barrels, and everything else the war machine demanded. What almost nobody on that floor knew was that a corner of the company had gone dark. Beginning in 1943, behind guarded doors, Norton supplied boron to the Manhattan Project's secretive SAM laboratory in New York. In late 1945, it took a subcontract from Brush Beryllium to fuse beryllium oxide, and through the following decade, Norton workers pressed and fired some of the most dangerous materials on Earth. Beryllium oxide shaped into rods and hexagonal rings blended with uranium oxide for early reactor work, crucibles for melting uranium at Argonne, fused thorium slugs destined for the reactors at Hanford. The federal government formally classed Norton as an atomic weapons employer and beryllium vendor, and the men on those contracts worked behind locked doors, forbidden to discuss what they made even with the machinists one building over. The work ran under Atomic Energy Commission contracts until 1961, with radiological decommissioning stretching to 1962, and federal screening reports later described the plant's 6 buildings where much of it happened with one blunt phrase: very dusty. Dust was the whole tragedy. Beryllium particles, invisible in the air of a poorly ventilated press room, scar the lungs permanently. Chronic beryllium disease is incurable, debilitating, and often fatal. And by 1949, at least one Norton worker had already died of beryllium poisoning. The men mixing and finishing those refractories had no idea what they were handling or what it was for. Decades later, the federal government created the Energy Employees Occupational Illness Compensation Program to pay atomic-era workers ruined by exposure, and Norton's veterans were designated a special exposure cohort, first for the production years 1945 through 1957, then for the decommissioning period through October of 1962, because so few exposure records existed that doses could not even be reconstructed. When Boston University ran a beryllium screening program for former Massachusetts atomic workers, the company declined to cooperate, citing a union organizing drive underway at the time. The Cold War was won, in some small part, in Greendale, and the receipt was paid in lung tissue. The peace brought its own reckoning. In the late 1940s, federal antitrust suits caught up with the abrasives industry, and Norton, along with its rivals, consented to abandon the price-fixing arrangements and trade combines that had quietly ordered the business for years. The cozy world of gentlemen's agreements was over, and the post-war decades remade the company's shape. Norton went public in 1962, ending 3/4 of a century of family control, and diversified into everything from industrial ceramics to sealants. John Jepson II, grandson of the kiln master, took the presidency in 1967, and when Robert Cushman took over in 1971, he pruned hard, selling off the machine tool division that Charles Norton had built, its grinding machine line passing to Warner and Swayze and eventually fading away. The company bought the Christensen Company of Salt Lake City in 1976 for its diamond drill bits, pushed deeper into super abrasives, and watched its old open-shop world dissolve, with half the workforce unionized by 1973. By the mid-1980s, Norton was a diversified multinational with plants across dozens of countries, still headquartered in the same corner of Worcester, still anchored by the abrasives that started it all. Which brings the story back to the spring of 1990, and the morning Worcester woke up under attack. On March 15th, the British conglomerate BTR announced a hostile tender offer for the Norton Company, $75 a share in cash against a stock price around $58, a bid worth $1.64 billion. The next day, more than 5 million Norton shares changed hands on the New York Stock Exchange as arbitrageurs piled in. Wall Street loved it. Massachusetts did not. BTR carried a reputation as one of the most ruthless acquirers in Britain, a conglomerate that bought companies, stripped their assets, gutted research budgets, and cut jobs to service the debt. And Norton at that moment employed 16,000 people worldwide, 3,000 of them in Massachusetts. In Worcester, where Norton had underwritten a century of civic life, the bid read less like a transaction and more like a raid on the city itself. The board deployed its poison pill, a defense designed to make any unwanted purchase ruinously expensive, and BTR answered with the one weapon that cuts through a pill, a proxy fight aimed at throwing out all 12 directors at the annual meeting scheduled for April 26th and installing a slate that would dismantle the defenses from inside. The company had 6 weeks to live or die. What happened next had no precedent in American corporate life. On March 19th, several thousand Norton workers and supporters rallied at Worcester City Hall, and Milton P. Higgins II, grandson of the company's first president, elderly and in a wheelchair in one of his last public appearances, commandeered the microphone of a police car to address the crowd. Governor Dukakis and the congressional delegation threw themselves into the fight, and roughly 120 members of Congress asked President Bush for a national security review, pointing to Norton's ceramic components for aerospace. Then the legislature moved. In a matter of days, it passed a bill requiring every Massachusetts public corporation to elect its board in staggered 3-year classes, which meant BTR could not seize control in a single vote, no matter how many shares it bought. Dukakis signed it with cheering Norton employees at his back and cast the whole affair as a second war of independence against a British invader. BTR was cornered, and Norton went hunting for a rescuer. It found one in Paris. On April 25th, one day before the shareholder meeting, Norton agreed to be acquired by Compagnie de Saint-Gobain, the French glass and materials giant founded in 1665, for $90 a share in cash, valuing the company at about $1.9 billion. Saint-Gobain committed to keep the Worcester headquarters, maintain operations and benefits, and preserve the Norton name. BTR walked away, selling its stake into the run-up for a profit of about $14 million, a consolation prize for losing a war it had every financial reason to win. The Grinding Wheel Company had been saved by an act of the legislature and a white knight from the Ancien regime. Saint-Gobain largely kept its word. It modernized the aging Greendale works, expanded across the region with new ceramics and materials operations in nearby Northborough, and kept Worcester at the center of its North American abrasives business. The operation was formally renamed Saint-Gobain Abrasives in 2001, with the Norton brand preserved on every wheel and belt, and that same year, after more than a century of open shop resistance stretching back to Alden and Spence, Worcester production workers voted 406 to 386 to join the United Auto Workers. The margin was 20 votes. The wait had been 116 years. Today, Norton remains Saint-Gobain's flagship abrasives campus, still at 1 New Bond Street in Greendale, still manufacturing vitrified wheels a short walk from where Sven Pulson fired the first one, with a new 47,000 square foot administration building completed on the site in early 2026. That is what an industrial empire actually looks like up close. Grit and cruelty fused together at 2,300 degrees, and it is why a state once went to war over a grinding wheel. If stories like this one are why you are here, subscribe to Trade Archive, because next time we are opening the file on another machine that quietly built the modern world.